Have you ever prayed so many times that God's silence started to feel like rejection? Ethan did. After losing his job, watching bills pile up, and seeing no answers, he reached the point where giving up felt easier than believing. Then he discovered something unexpected. Elijah, one of God's greatest prophets, once begged for his life to end. Yet God didn't condemn him. He met him in his exhaustion. That's when Ethan realized the darkest moments aren't always signs that God has left. Sometimes they're where he begins his deepest work. And what happened next changed everything Ethan thought he knew about hopelessness. Have you ever reached a point where you weren't sure if you were tired from fighting life's battles or tired from hoping things would finally get better? Maybe you've smiled in front of others while carrying a weight no one could see. Maybe you've whispered prayers late at night and wondered why the silence felt louder than any answer. And perhaps the question you are afraid to say out loud is this: how much longer can I keep going like this? The truth is, there are moments when the human heart becomes exhausted not because it is weak, but because it has been strong for far too long. We live in a world that tells us to push harder, hold on tighter, and never let anyone see us struggle. But what happens when your strength begins to run out? What happens when every new day feels like another mountain you don't have the energy to climb? Sometimes the deepest pain is not failure itself. It is the feeling that no one understands how hard you've been trying. It is watching doors stay closed after giving your best. It is wondering whether your tears matter to anyone at all. And in those quiet moments, a dangerous thought can begin to grow. Maybe it's time to stop believing that things will change. Yet what if that feeling is not the end of your story? What if the very moment you feel closest to giving up is also revealing something important about your soul? Before we talk about answers, before we talk about faith, know this: if your heart feels heavy today, you are not alone, and your struggle may be more understood than you realize. Ethan understood that feeling all too well. Not long ago, he had been the person others depended on. He worked hard, carried responsibilities without complaint, and believed that if he stayed faithful and did his best, things would eventually work out. But life did not unfold the way he expected. One setback became another. A lost job turned into financial pressure. Unanswered applications became months of uncertainty. The future that once seemed clear now felt covered in fog. Yet the hardest part was not what was happening around him. It was what was happening inside him. Every morning, he fought a quiet battle between hope and disappointment. One voice told him to keep trusting. Another whispered that trust was only making the pain last longer. Have you ever felt trapped between those two voices? Have you ever wanted to believe, but found yourself too exhausted to keep carrying the weight of expectation? Ethan still prayed, but his prayers no longer sounded confident. They sounded tired. He wasn't asking for great miracles anymore. He simply wanted to know that his struggles meant something. One of the deepest wounds a person can carry is not failure itself. It is feeling invisible in the middle of it. Sometimes we assume our breaking point comes because life is too hard, but often it comes because we have been carrying our burdens alone for too long. That is why compassion matters. Every person you meet may be fighting a battle you cannot see. Ethan slowly realized that his tears, his fears, and even his doubts did not make him weak. They made him human. And perhaps one of life's quietest truths is this: the heart does not heal by pretending it is strong. It begins to heal when it finally admits that it is hurting. Still, Ethan had no idea that a small moment was approaching, one that would challenge everything he believed about God's silence. One evening, after another day that seemed to end exactly where it began, Ethan sat alone in the quiet of his apartment. The worries were still there. The unanswered questions had not disappeared. His circumstances looked no different than they had the day before. Yet something inside him felt too tired to keep wrestling with the same thoughts. Almost absent-mindedly, he opened his Bible, not because he expected a miracle, but because he didn't know what else to do. His eyes landed on a verse he had read many times before. Under normal circumstances, he might have turned the page without thinking. But that night, one simple truth seemed to reach a place inside him that his own reasoning never could. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No thunder. No sudden breakthrough. Just a quiet reminder that God sees people differently than they see themselves. Ethan sat there for a long time, reflecting on how often pain narrows our vision. When we are hurting, we tend to measure life by what is missing. We count the closed doors, the disappointments, and the delays. But what if there are things happening that we cannot yet see? What if silence is not always absence? For the first time in months, Ethan stopped asking why everything was taking so long and began wondering if there was more to the story than he understood. The burden on his shoulders did not instantly become lighter, but it no longer felt completely hopeless. Sometimes the first step toward healing is not finding an answer. Sometimes it is discovering a reason to keep listening. That night, Ethan learned a quiet lesson many people overlook. Hope rarely arrives as a loud announcement. More often, it enters like a small light in a dark room, easy to miss unless you are willing to pause and notice it. And though he could not yet see where the path was leading, something within him had begun to shift. For a brief moment, Ethan thought that small spark of hope might change everything. But the days that followed looked painfully familiar. The bills were still waiting. The opportunities he prayed for still failed to appear. The uncertainty remained. In some ways, the tiny glimpse of hope made the struggle even harder, because now he found himself caught between two realities. Part of him wanted to trust that God was doing something. Another part wondered whether he had simply imagined it. Isn't that one of life's strangest paradoxes? Sometimes disappointment hurts more after hope has returned. It is easier to accept darkness when you expect nothing. It is much harder when you begin believing that light might be near. Ethan started asking questions that reached deeper than his circumstances. Questions about himself. Questions about faith. Questions about what it means to keep believing when evidence seems to point in the opposite direction. Was faith supposed to feel this difficult? Was trust supposed to survive uncertainty? Or had he misunderstood something all along? The longer he wrestled with these thoughts, the more he realized that his greatest battle was no longer external. It was happening within his own heart. There is a hidden struggle many people never talk about. We often think exhaustion comes from carrying heavy burdens, but sometimes it comes from carrying unanswered questions. The mind searches for certainty while life offers ambiguity. The heart longs for clarity while the future remains hidden. Ethan discovered that not knowing can be its own kind of suffering. Yet another surprising truth began to emerge. Growth rarely happens when every answer is available. Character is often formed in the uncomfortable space between what we understand and what we must trust. Even so, Ethan was approaching a crossroads. The questions inside him were becoming louder, and soon he would face the most difficult question of all. If God truly cared, why did his silence feel so personal? There came a night when Ethan could no longer hide from the questions that had been growing inside him. The exhaustion was deeper than physical fatigue. It settled into his thoughts, his prayers, and the quiet spaces of his heart. He stared into the darkness and wondered whether anyone truly understood what he was carrying. For months, he had tried to remain faithful. He had tried to stay hopeful. But now he found himself asking a question he never thought he would ask. God, are you even listening? The words frightened him, not because they were disrespectful, but because they were honest. Sometimes the most painful moments of faith are not when we stop believing in God. They are when we still believe He exists but can no longer understand what He is doing. Ethan felt trapped between trust and confusion. He remembered prayers that seemed unanswered, doors that remained closed, and hopes that had quietly faded. The silence felt personal, not like an empty room, but like standing outside a locked door and wondering why no one was opening it. Yet beneath his frustration was something even more vulnerable. He wasn't only afraid that his situation would never change. He was afraid that his life no longer mattered the way he thought it did. Many people carry this hidden fear. We often tell ourselves that we need solutions, but sometimes what we truly need is reassurance that we have not been forgotten. The human heart can endure tremendous hardship when it knows it is loved. Ethan sat with that ache for a long time. No dramatic answer arrived. No instant breakthrough appeared. But somewhere beneath the disappointment, a tiny spark remained alive. It was weak, almost invisible, yet it refused to disappear completely. Perhaps that was because faith is not the absence of questions. Sometimes faith is the fragile decision to keep searching for light even when darkness seems to have the louder voice. And though Ethan could not see it yet, his deepest crisis was quietly leading him toward a truth he desperately needed to discover. In the days that followed, Ethan stopped trying so hard to force answers. Not because he had solved his problems, but because he no longer had the strength to wrestle with every uncertainty. One evening, while reflecting on the story of Elijah, something unexpected caught his attention. Elijah was not rebuked for being exhausted. He was not shamed for feeling overwhelmed. Before anything else happened, he was allowed to rest. That detail stayed with Ethan. For years, he had quietly assumed that strong faith meant always pushing forward, always staying positive, always carrying more. But what if he had misunderstood strength itself? What if strength was not the ability to endure endlessly, but the humility to admit when you needed help? The thought lingered in his mind. It challenged something deep within him. So many people spend their lives believing they must earn peace through performance. They tell themselves they can rest after they achieve more, fix more, or become more. Yet the strange paradox of life is that exhaustion often grows faster than accomplishment. Ethan began to wonder if some of his suffering came not from the burdens he carried, but from the pressure he placed on himself to carry them perfectly. This realization did not remove his fears. The future was still uncertain. The questions were still unanswered. But a new perspective was quietly emerging. Perhaps being human was never meant to mean having all the answers. Perhaps it meant learning to walk forward despite not having them. There was something deeply comforting in that thought. It reminded Ethan that his worth was not measured by how much he could endure without breaking. It was measured by something far deeper and far more constant. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small release inside his heart. And with that release came a subtle but powerful lesson. Sometimes the greatest obstacle between us and peace is not the storm around us, but the belief that we must survive it alone. As Ethan reflected on everything he had been carrying, he began to notice something he had overlooked for a long time. He had been looking at his life through the narrow window of the present moment. Every disappointment felt final because he could only see what was directly in front of him. Every delay felt meaningless because he could not see beyond it. But then a gentle thought entered his mind. What if a chapter is not the same thing as the whole story? We rarely judge a book by a single page, yet many of us judge our lives by a single season. When pain lasts longer than expected, it becomes easy to believe that it will last forever. Yet some of the most important parts of our lives only make sense when viewed from a greater distance. Ethan thought about people who had later discovered purpose in experiences they once wished had never happened. At the time, those experiences felt like interruptions. Years later, they realized those very moments had shaped their compassion, wisdom, resilience, and character. Perhaps life is full of seeds that look insignificant when they are first planted. Buried beneath the soil, they appear invisible and forgotten. Yet hidden growth is still growth. That realization brought Ethan an unexpected sense of peace. He did not need to understand everything immediately for his journey to have meaning. Sometimes we suffer because we demand answers from today that only tomorrow can provide. There is a quiet freedom in accepting that some truths reveal themselves slowly. The future remained uncertain, but it no longer felt empty. Ethan began to see that not every unanswered question was a sign of abandonment. Some questions were invitations to grow in ways he could not yet measure. And perhaps that is one of life's gentlest mysteries. What feels like a detour from our perspective may one day be revealed as an essential part of the path that led us exactly where we needed to be. The circumstances around Ethan had not changed very much, but something within him no longer responded to them in the same way. For so long, he had treated peace as a destination that could only be reached after every problem was solved. He believed that once the right opportunity arrived, once the uncertainty disappeared, once life finally made sense, then he would be able to rest. But slowly he began to realize how exhausting that way of living had become. He had spent years postponing peace until the future gave him permission to have it. What if peace was never meant to be the reward at the end of the journey? What if it was something that could accompany him along the way? That question changed more than he expected. Ethan started releasing the need to control every outcome. He stopped measuring his worth by his productivity, his success, or his ability to hold everything together. Instead of constantly asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he began asking, "What can this season teach me?" It was a subtle shift, but it transformed the way he viewed his life. The people who had disappointed him no longer occupied so much space in his mind. The mistakes he had made no longer defined his identity. Even his fears seemed less powerful when he stopped fighting them and started acknowledging them with honesty and grace. One of the deepest forms of courage is not the ability to avoid fear. It is the willingness to keep moving forward without allowing fear to decide who you become. Ethan was beginning to understand that. He felt more patient with himself, more compassionate toward others, more willing to accept that growth often looks slower than we wish. The burden he carried had not vanished, but it no longer felt like a chain around his heart. In its place was something gentler and stronger at the same time, a quiet confidence that even if he could not see the entire path ahead, he did not need to walk it perfectly to keep moving forward. De ghi nan va se zem de long gwen tak, kachian bat buk, cho ton bo kak fan teep theo qua duan nai. 2 fan 9 trod, twi se tuan Thursday, not chuan kak qui tak sao. Kubang kam suk truok kai kubang su kien. Luan bat dao tu kam suk. Noi dao. Sujong xe hok nu ka sao ben trong con nuboy truok kai nak din, bat ky chi teet kin ton now. Kong viet nu mot by jong. Kong lin lop. Kong jiao ju. Kong jai tik than hok dai dong. By hok fi zut hien, tu nin thong qua tre neum. Suin gam va han trin noi tom quan in vat. Kong su dung noi so de juchan nuoi zem. Kong de doa, ket on. Tau mak cam toi loi hok geo rac tuet vong. Luan ju mot tia sang qua hai vong. Lom trak in va su chua lan. Nutrizem moi la nan vat chin tuksu. Ethan chi la tam guang fan chiu. Moi cam suk. Ka hoi va kung hong qua Ethan fi keen nuoi zem gi. Du chin la min. Kin ton la ke ka dan den su chua lan. Kong fi dike den koi kong. Kak ka chi and kin ton duok su dung de jup nuoi zem. Hu ban than han. Chua lan tun thuong. Trong ton han. Yu thuong han. Man mi han. Song ko hai vong han. Moi fan fi tau ra at not mot gia, tri chi and hoa. Sao moi fan. Nuoi zem kin nan duok at not mot trong kak du sao. Tu ti han voi chin min. Bao dung han voi nuoi kok. Man mi han trong engage can. Hu ban than sao sak han. Ko them hai vong. Ko them ben and noi tom. Nugwai ra, de ju dung tin than qua human healing through biblical stories. Kak fan teep theo seutn ka truck. Emotion reflection human truth biblical mirror healing insight hope thay v. Bible event explanation lesson nu ve. Trong tom se loan la chua lan con nuoi thong qua ka chi and kinton. Chu kong fi chi ku lai ka chi and kinton. One morning, nothing extraordinary happened. The sky looked the same. The challenges were still waiting for Ethan. His bank account had not suddenly changed, and the future was still unwritten. Yet as he sat quietly with his coffee, he noticed something that would have seemed impossible a few months earlier. He was no longer waking up with the same sense of dread. The weight was not completely gone, but it no longer felt like it owned him. And that realization felt like a small miracle. How often do we overlook the healing that happens before our circumstances improve? We wait for dramatic breakthroughs, while the heart is already learning to breathe again. Ethan began to recognize moments he would have ignored before, a kind word from a friend, a peaceful walk in the evening, a sense of gratitude that appeared without warning. These were not solutions to his problems, but they were reminders that life still contained goodness. Sometimes hope does not arrive as an open door. Sometimes it arrives as the strength to keep knocking without bitterness. That thought stayed with him. For so long, he had measured progress by visible results. Now he was beginning to measure it by something deeper. Wasn't it possible that healing starts long before we realize it? Wasn't it possible that faith grows strongest not when everything works out, but when we learn to trust that our story still has value even before the ending is clear? Ethan found himself feeling grateful in ways he could not fully explain. Not because life had become easy, but because he could finally see that hardship had not taken everything from him. It had revealed strengths, compassion, and resilience he never knew he possessed. For the first time in a very long while, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like a chapter he was willing to keep reading, trusting that there might be more beauty ahead than he could currently imagine. Looking back on everything he had endured, Ethan finally understood something he could not have learned any other way. The greatest battle of his life had never been about losing a job, facing uncertainty, or waiting for circumstances to change. It had been about the quiet belief that his value depended on outcomes he could not control. For years, he had carried an invisible burden that many people know all too well. He believed he had to prove himself worthy through success, strength, and constant progress. But what happens when life removes the very things we use to measure our worth? What remains when the achievements fade, the plans fall apart, and the answers refuse to come? Those questions once terrified him. Now they revealed something freeing. Ethan realized that giving up and letting go were not the same thing. Giving up means abandoning hope because the future does not look the way we expected. Letting go means releasing the illusion that we can control every chapter of our story. One leads to despair. The other creates space for peace. That distinction changed everything. He no longer felt responsible for carrying the weight of the entire future on his shoulders. He only needed the courage to take the next step with honesty, patience, and trust. There is a wisdom that often emerges only after hardship. Life becomes lighter when we stop demanding certainty before we allow ourselves to live. How many beautiful moments are lost because we keep postponing joy until every problem is solved? How much energy is spent fighting realities that first need to be accepted? Ethan's journey taught him that strength is not found in never struggling. It is found in remaining open-hearted through the struggle. It is choosing kindness when disappointment could make you bitter. It is choosing hope when fear offers easier answers. And perhaps the deepest revelation of all is this: peace does not come from knowing exactly what will happen next. It comes from knowing that your life still holds meaning, value, and possibility even when the path ahead remains unseen. As Ethan continued moving forward, he noticed that some of the heaviest things he carried were not financial worries or unanswered questions. They were the invisible burdens he had stored inside his heart for years. Regrets he could not change. Expectations he could not fulfill. Disappointments he never allowed himself to grieve. He had spent so much energy trying to be strong that he rarely gave himself permission to be human. Perhaps you know that feeling too. Perhaps there are moments from your past that still visit you in quiet hours, reminding you of what went wrong, what was lost, or who you used to be. Ethan began to understand that healing is not always about fixing what is broken. Sometimes it begins by treating your own wounded heart with the same kindness you would offer someone you love. That realization softened something inside him. He no longer felt the need to fight every painful memory. Instead, he learned to sit with them without allowing them to define him. He thought about the people who had hurt him, and for the first time, he realized that forgiveness was not about pretending the pain never happened. It was about refusing to let that pain control the rest of his story. There is a quiet freedom that comes when we stop carrying yesterday into every tomorrow. Little by little, Ethan released the pressure to have all the answers. He released the shame of not being where he thought he should be. He released the belief that his struggles made him less worthy of love, compassion, or hope. And as those burdens loosened their grip, a deep sense of peace began to take their place. Not a perfect peace, not the kind that removes every challenge, but the kind that gently whispers, "You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to keep moving forward without carrying everything alone." In that moment, Ethan realized that perhaps one of the most courageous acts in life is not holding on tighter, but finally allowing yourself to let go. As Ethan looked back on his journey, he realized that the lessons he had learned were not meant to stay in moments of hardship. They were meant to accompany him into everyday life. After all, most of life is not lived during dramatic breakthroughs. It is lived in ordinary conversations, busy workdays, family dinners, unexpected disappointments, and quiet mornings when no one else sees the battles taking place inside us. One lesson stayed with him more than any other. People are often carrying more than they reveal. That understanding made him more patient with others and gentler with himself. How many arguments begin because someone feels unseen? How many relationships suffer because people are hurting in silence? Sometimes a little compassion accomplishes more than perfect advice ever could. Ethan also learned that uncertainty is not a sign that life is failing. It is often a normal part of growth. In work, relationships, and personal goals, there will always be seasons when the next step is unclear. Yet waiting does not have to mean wasting time. Some of the most important growth happens while nothing seems to be happening at all. He discovered that resilience is not built by avoiding difficult seasons. It is built by walking through them without losing your capacity to love, hope, and remain open-hearted. That perspective changed the way he approached setbacks. Instead of asking, Why is this happening to me? He became more curious about who he was becoming through it. Perhaps that question can change more than we realize. In family life, it can help us choose understanding over judgment. In friendships, it can help us choose presence over perfection. In our personal journey, it can remind us that growth is rarely linear. Ethan's story revealed a simple but powerful truth. Life becomes more meaningful when we stop measuring ourselves solely by results and begin valuing the qualities that no circumstance can take away: kindness, courage, humility, patience, and the ability to keep moving forward with hope. By the time Ethan reached this place in his journey, something beautiful had happened. Not because every problem had disappeared, not because every question had been answered, but because he was no longer the same person who had once sat in the darkness wondering if he could keep going. The fear that had once consumed him no longer held the same power. The uncertainty that had once felt unbearable no longer seemed like an enemy. He had discovered that hope is not something we find at the end of the road. It is something that quietly walks beside us, even when we cannot see very far ahead. As he reflected on everything he had learned, Ethan felt an unexpected gratitude for the path he would never have chosen. Not because the pain was good, but because it had revealed strengths, compassion, and wisdom that comfort alone could never have taught him. Perhaps this is true for many of us. We spend so much time wishing we could skip the difficult chapters that we forget those chapters are often shaping the person we are becoming. If your heart feels weary today, if you are carrying burdens no one else can see, know that there is nothing wrong with being tired. There is nothing wrong with needing rest, needing grace, or needing time to heal. You do not have to have everything figured out before you are worthy of peace. You do not have to be fearless before you can move forward. Sometimes courage is simply choosing to take one more step while carrying a hopeful heart. And maybe that is where your story is today, not at the end, but in the middle of a chapter you do not fully understand yet. A chapter that still holds possibilities you cannot see. A chapter where healing is already taking place beneath the surface. So be gentle with yourself. The road ahead may still have twists and turns, but there is light before you. There is meaning in your journey. And there is every reason to believe that your most beautiful pages have not been written yet.